A single grain of white rock once sparked wars that reshaped continents. The story of salt is the hidden backbone of empires, economies, and revolutions, and you'll be surprised how much of our modern world still tastes its influence. Think about the world before refrigeration, before spices traveled across oceans, before the word salary meant anything beyond a paycheck. Back then, a handful of salt could buy a horse, fund a legion, or keep a city alive through a harsh winter. The need to preserve meat, to flavor bland diets, to make water drinkable, these simple needs turned a mineral into a strategic asset. From the deserts of the Sahara to the marshes of the Danube, salt routes stitched together cultures, sparked conflicts, and even birthed entire economies. It wasn't just seasoning, it was power. Imagine a bustling market where the most valuable commodity isn't gold, but a handful of pink crystals glistening in the sun. Traders from distant lands would travel weeks, sometimes months, across treacherous terrain, just to bring back a load of salt. The very existence of those routes forced societies to organize, to build roads, to protect caravans. In ancient China, the state monopolized salt production as early as the 3rd century BCE, using it to fund massive public works like the Great Wall. In Rome, soldiers were paid in salarium, the allowance that eventually became the word salary. Salt wasn't a side dish. It was the main course of statecraft. The first major chapter of this salty saga begins in the cradle of civilization, where the first permanent settlements sprang up near natural salt deposits. The ancient city of Jericho, one of the world's oldest known towns, sat beside a salt spring that attracted nomadic groups seeking a reliable source of mineral. Those early settlers quickly realized that controlling the spring meant controlling the flow of food preservation and trade. By the time the Sumerians rose along the Tigris and Euphrates, they had already established a sophisticated trade network that moved salt inland, exchanging it for barley, wool, and copper. The salt trade turned the Fertile Crescent into a bustling hub, laying the groundwork for complex economies that could support priests, scribes, and architects. Why would a simple mineral be worth the trouble of building entire cities? The answer lies in its unique properties. Salt preserves meat and fish, turning perishable protein into a stable food source that can survive long journeys. In a world without refrigeration, armies depended on salted pork and fish to feed troops on campaigns that lasted months. The Roman legions, marching across Europe, carried salted pork as their staple ration. Without salt, those legions would have starved long before they could conquer Gaul. The ability to feed an army reliably gave commanders a strategic edge that few other technologies could match. Salt also became a universal medium of exchange, especially in societies where coinage was scarce or unstable. In medieval Europe, the salt tax was a major source of revenue for monarchs. In the German city of Halle, salt was so valuable that it was used as a unit of account. A Halle salt could buy a cow, a piece of land, or a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. In West Africa, the trans-Saharan trade routes linked the gold-rich kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai with the salt mines of Tagaisa. Gold flowed north, salt flowed south, and the balance of power rested on those two commodities. The phrase gold for salt was not a metaphor, it was the literal exchange that fueled empires. The power of salt also made it a frequent cause of conflict, and history is dotted with wars fought over its control. The Roman Empire, for example, fiercely guarded the salt pans of Ostia, the port city that supplied the capital. When the Goths sacked Rome in 410 CE, they specifically targeted the city's salt stores, knowing that without them the empire's food supply would crumble. In the 16th century, the Portuguese fought the War of the Salt against the Sultanate of Gujarat to dominate the lucrative Indian Ocean salt trade. Their victory gave them a monopoly over the supply of salt in the region, which in turn funded further colonial expansion. Perhaps the most famous salt conflict is the Salt March of 1930, led by Mahatma Gandhi. While the British Empire imposed a heavy salt tax on India, making it illegal for Indians to produce or sell salt independently, Gandhi's 240-mile walk to the Arabian Sea was a deliberate act of civil disobedience. He and his followers gathered salt from the shore, breaking the law in a simple, symbolic gesture. That single act sparked a massive wave of non-violent resistance, eventually forcing the British to reconsider their tax policy. The march showed that salt could be a catalyst for political change, not just a commercial commodity. Naval power also hinged on salt. The age of exploration was powered by fleets that needed to keep crews fed on long voyages across open water. Salted beef and hardtack became the staple diet of sailors on ships like Columbus's Caravels or the British HMS Victory. When the British Royal Navy introduced the salted meat ration in the 18th century, it dramatically increased the endurance of its crews, giving Britain a decisive advantage in global conflicts such as the 7 Years' War. The ability to project power across oceans depended as much on the supply chain of salt as on the number of cannons aboard a ship. Even the map of the world was drawn by salt routes. The ancient salt road that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Baltic Sea linked the Roman Empire with the Germanic tribes of the north. In the Americas, the Inca built an extensive network of roads that connected salt mines in the high Andes with coastal cities, ensuring that their armies and bureaucrats had a steady supply of preserved food. In the American West, the Salt Lake City settlement began as a refuge for Mormon pioneers who needed a reliable water source. The nearby Great Salt Lake also provided a source of salt for preserving meat during harsh winters. In each case, the geography of salt dictated the placement of forts, towns, and trade hubs. Fast forward to the industrial era, and salt's role evolved but never disappeared. The rise of chemical industries turned salt into a raw material for producing chlorine, soda ash, and other essential chemicals. The massive Solvay process, patented in the 1860s, used salt and limestone to create soda ash, a key ingredient in glass, soap, and paper. This transformation turned salt from a food preservative into a cornerstone of modern manufacturing. Nations that secured large salt deposits could now produce critical industrial chemicals, giving them an economic edge in the age of mass production. Yet, despite its monumental impact, salt often slips into the background of our collective memory. We sprinkle it on fries without a second thought, unaware that the same crystals once funded wars and built cities. The twist is that we are now entering a new era where salt could become scarce again, not because the earth runs out, but because climate change threatens the evaporation ponds that produce sea salt. Rising sea levels could flood traditional salt flats, while droughts could diminish the freshwater sources needed for mining rock salt. If the supply tightens, the price could rise, and governments might once again treat it as a strategic resource, just as they did centuries ago. Imagine a future where nations negotiate salt treaties alongside oil and gas agreements. Picture a scenario where a coastal city's water treatment plant can't produce enough brine for the local salt industry, leading to shortages in food preservation and chemical manufacturing. The very commodity that once allowed empires to flourish could become a flashpoint for new geopolitical tensions. The lesson from history is clear. When a resource becomes essential, it becomes power. So, what does the story of salt teach us about the forces that shape civilization? It shows that the simplest elements can drive the most complex dynamics. It reminds us that economics, warfare, and culture are often anchored in the practical needs of survival. And it warns us that complacency about abundant resources can leave societies vulnerable when those resources shift. If you could travel back in time and sit at a table with a Roman legionary, a Chinese salt tax collector, and a 20th century Indian freedom fighter, what single question would you ask them about the white crystals that defined their lives?